We should restore the estuary because it makes the most sense from an environmental standpoint. That estuary, if it were restored, would, for example, provide a nursery, a pretty good nursery for juvenile salmon, Chinook, which are endangered in Puget Sound. I think it would also take care of some of the invasive species problems that we have there. And it would basically restore a natural system that has been, because of human intervention, essentially been made unnatural, and therefore it can't do the things that it would normally do and it's supposed to do. And who should we do it for? I think we should do it for all of the members of that environmental ecosystem, including the people who live here. And I think especially we owe some kind of acknowledgement to the people who originally lived there. One of the things that people talk about is, historic Capitol Lake. Well, Capitol Lake has only been in existence since 1951, and prior to that, there were communities, in addition to Olympia and Tumwater, there were communities that were there for hundreds and maybe thousands of years before, living in that system, and we sort of blew them off when we built that dam, and I think this is a chance to sort of right that wrong and also honor them. So yeah, it's for people and for the ecosystem, which are the same thing, really. So what's my personal motivation to be involved in the estuary restoration? Well, I'm a fish guy. I started off as a kid in Wisconsin, where I grew up as being an angler, and so I cared a lot about fish. And then I fell in love with a woman from Olympia, Washington, and found myself living out here, starting in about the mid-1970s, which was just about the time that the fish wars, the so-called fish wars, were at their peak. And suddenly I discovered that my pastime of fishing had some real political implications. Yeah, I came out here, it was the middle of the fish wars with Billy Frank Jr. and Marlon Brando and Dick Gregory on the Nisqually, and all that stuff was going on, and I just wanted to go fishing, and I thought, well, I guess I better find out what's going on around here. So I actually began what became a sort of a lifelong study of salmon and the history of salmon and their interactions with people. So when the idea of restoring the Deschutes estuary came along, when I first became aware of it, that was something that I resonated to, because I thought this could be beneficial for fish, especially in Puget Sound. I also live above the Deschutes River. When the leaves are off the trees, I can see it from my house. I fish in the Deschutes River, so I've got a kind of a long relationship with the Deschutes and with the estuary, and I'm probably forgetting most of the connections, but it's been long and it's been deep and it's been pretty wide. So, I just feel like fish are, first of all, they're important to us, but they're also an indicator. If fish and trout can live in a watershed, that means it's probably okay for us to live there too, because they need the same things that we need, which is cold, clean, well-oxygenated water. And so there's a certain amount of self-preservation there, in addition to just talking about environmental integrity. So, yeah. I've been thinking about this question all week, and one of the things that I wanted, what are my ethical motivations? And one of the things that I wanted to say is that I don't want to give the impression that I think that people who want to restore the estuary are somehow ethically or morally superior to people who don't, because there are plenty of people of goodwill on both of those sides of the issue, and probably in the middle as well. And So, and some of them are friends of mine. So, just to get that out of the way. But my motivation for that is I think that there's an ethical imperative that comes right out of the first chapters of Genesis for people to be very careful stewards of ecological integrity. And you can talk about that in a whole variety of ways, but I think that's the first thing that God says to people after He creates them, and you're supposed to tend and keep the garden, which is to care for it in a careful way that recognizes the integrity of the environment and also recognizes the fact that if you take care of this, this will take care of you. So there's a reciprocity there too. And I think that's a deep ethical imperative from a religious standpoint. Obviously, you don't have to be religious in order to want to do that. But for me, as a person of faith, that's where my ethical. And so here's a ecosystem that clearly needs some work. And so we have an opportunity to do it. I think the other thing about this is it's so, the location of it is just so compelling. It's right underneath the state capitol. And, you know, every year the politicians come and talk about cleaning up Puget Sound and doing whatever we have to do to try to make Puget Sound well and whole. And then they've got this sort of abomination right underneath their noses that they don't want to deal with. And so some of it's Olympia politics too, I guess. But yeah, so those are my ethical motivations, saying that, you know, this lake is very symbolic just because of its location, in addition to all the other things you could say about it. So, yeah. What's the biggest ethical dilemma and how might we resolve it? That's an interesting question. I mean, I think I alluded to it a moment ago. And the challenge is always, for me at least, when you're talking about these kinds of issues, there are people who have multiple stakes and multiple viewpoints in them. So, and they have, you know, legitimate reasons for taking the position that they do. And I think the biggest dilemma is how you do the right thing that, you know, recognizes the integrity of this system and still figure out a way to somehow honor those motivations that people have. And you know, certainly that's a political issue because, you know, politics is the art of the possible and you have to try to keep everybody at least semi-happy. But it's also, I think it's also an ethical dilemma because you know, people are also passionate about, you know, and believe that what they're doing is, you know, quote unquote the right thing. And because of human limitations, I think it's really hard to know sometimes what the right thing is. I'm pretty clear that I think I know what the right thing to do with the Deschutes estuary is, and that is to restore it as quickly as possible. But I also know that there are people who are equally passionate, and some for environmental reasons. You know, there's people who worry about the bats. There's a whole bat issue that bats that use that lake. You know, David Milne, who's a retired professor from Evergreen, you know, basically claims that that Capitol Lake is essentially an environmental advantage to Puget Sound rather than a detriment. I don't agree with him, but, you know, he has, you know, I think he takes that position in good faith, you know, I have to believe. And so recognizing that and then trying to work your way through all of those positions and say, you know, how are we going to do this? So the state now is, you know, in a process to try to do that, and it's certainly not a perfect process, and it certainly isn't a very short process. It feels like we've been doing this forever, but you know, that's the task. So yeah, I think that's how I think about that. Well, how can people get involved in the restoration efforts? I think the first thing people can do is just inform themselves about it. And I know our organization, the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team, has a website There's also a website for the people who are in favor of the lake, the Capitol Lake Improvement and Protection Association, CLIPA, and that's another website to peruse. The Department of Enterprise Services has just about every report that ever was done on Capitol Lake on their website. So just informing yourself is the first thing, and I'd say don't be put off by the fact that it might seem a little complicated. I think a person who's mildly curious and has some skills can figure it out. I mean, I can figure it out, and I'm no scientist, so that would be the first thing. And then hopefully you'll become convinced that the estuary is the one that makes the choice that makes sense. But then get involved with DERT or get involved with some other organization that does estuary restoration. If this one's too hot to handle for you, join the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group and work with them on some of the other salmon enhancement groups or projects around the Sound. But I'd say get informed and then get involved would be the ways. And try to remember this stuff when you're at candidate forums and you're in the voting booth. So those are the ways that I would think. One more. Write letters. Write letters since this is a writing class, write letters to the editor, write letters to the agencies, write letters to your elected officials, and tell them what you think. They need to hear from you. And it's a good way to use your writing 101 skills. So those are the ways I do it. So what's my definition of ethics? So this isn't a formal definition because I can't remember the formal definition. But we talked just a minute ago about the distinction between morals and ethics. And I'm not exactly sure what that's about, except that I think of ethics as the actions that we take. So, and they certainly grow out of our moral positions, of trying to do the right thing. And I think those are things they're the actions we take from that come from our deepest values, I would say. And for a person, like me, who's been formed in the Christian faith, they grow out of my understanding of, as my mother used to say, John, what would Jesus do? And if I could answer that question, then that would be the ethical thing to do in that situation. And I hated that question, by the way, and I would remind her that I was not Jesus, and she would say, yes, I know you're not Jesus. And, then we were off to the races. But so, yeah, the actions that we take that spring from our deepest moral values. And I think that to bring this around, to respect and enhance the integrity of the ecological systems that support us is a very deep moral, and then my ethics about trying to do that flow out of that. So